Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Jessica Weiss, Assistant Professor of Political Science and a Research Fellow at the Macmillan Center at Yale University. Her research interests include Chinese politics and international relations, nationalism, and social protest. Before joining the Yale faculty, she founded FACES, the Forum for American-Chinese Exchange at Stanford University. She teaches courses on anti-Americanism in world politics, Chinese foreign policy, and state-society relations in post-Mao China. Today we'll talk with her about her recent paper, Powerful Patriots, Anti-Foreign Protest in Authoritarian Regimes. Welcome, Professor Weiss.
Thank you for having me.
So let's talk about the argument you put forth in your paper. Tell us about it.
Well, in the paper, which is drawn from an excerpt of my larger book manuscript, I argue that authoritarian leaders like China's have strategic incentives to allow anti-foreign protests, which is to say popular demonstrations against foreign governments. And the argument's a little bit counterintuitive. The idea is that even though protests are risky and have the potential to turn against the government and spiral out of control, governments like China's actually find that these protests are useful in terms of generating diplomatic bargaining leverage. So that even though protests are risky, it's that risk and the difficulty of reining them in once they begin that give leaders sort of domestic political reasons to claim then on the international stage that, look, we're really here in a corner. If we're going to reach an agreement, you, the foreign government, need to cut us some slack.
Okay. And what drew you to write this paper? What was your inspiration?
Well, in 2005, there were a series of anti-Japanese protests that broke out in cities across China. And it seemed at the time that Western observers didn't have, let's say, a unified view of what was going on. There was a lot of controversy, and in particular, there were two common views. One suggested that the government had manufactured these protests, either as a way to rally the population around the Chinese government, to provide citizens with sort of a safety valve to release their grievances of whatever sort. But then, from a completely opposite view, others suggested that these protests were actually sort of the spontaneous eruption of legitimate grievances, and which were quite dangerous to the government, that they actually, rather than being a safety valve, could actually turn against the government if it were seen as being too weak in defending the nation's interests. So it was clear from that particular episode, which I analyze in this paper, that there was a gap in our understanding of what these protests meant, and particularly what their implications were for China's foreign relations.
Okay, and let's talk about your methodology. How did you collect the data for the paper?
Well, mostly I rely upon interviews and a close reading of Chinese internet websites. I spent over a year in China, living in Beijing, doing my field research, and it was clear through these interviews with nationalist activists, protest organizers, participants, internet forum managers, foreign ministry officials, even a policeman, that there was a pattern, that this was not an isolated incident, these 2005 anti-Japanese protests. And it was clear that although the Chinese government had allowed protests, nationalist protests in some cases in 2005, but also following the U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, the Chinese government had also on a number of occasions actually restrained students and others from taking to the streets, such as in 2001 when a U.S. spy plane collided with a Chinese fighter jet, causing the Chinese plane to ditch into the sea, and the pilot died. You might have expected, in fact, some suggested that there were protests, but in fact the Chinese government prevented protests from occurring and told the official media to turn down their rhetoric in covering that incident. Similarly, on the issue of Taiwan, an issue of great concern to Chinese nationalists, and in the news today, there haven't been to date any protests in China over the issue of Taiwan and Taiwan independence. So this sort of created for me a puzzle that I uncovered as I looked further into the background of the 2005 protests, just 2 years ago, in the lead up to the Olympics, there were a series of anti-French protests. So again, there's sort of multi-headed nationalism in China, and I think it's sort of little understood, but it's certainly there's a lot of material out there online in Chinese, but also foreign capitals pay great attention. So I looked at a lot of Japanese newspapers as well, interviewed Japanese and American officials throughout the course of my research.
Okay. I'm curious, were you able to talk to any Chinese officials, or was that not possible? Just in terms to get their feedback, possibly.
I did talk to a number of Chinese officials in different settings. Sometimes they would be visiting the United States and I'd have a chance to talk with them.
Okay.
Sometimes I visited them in this, there's a Starbucks next to the foreign ministry in Beijing, so sometimes I would see them there. By and large, they were very open to talking with me.
Oh, really?
And in fact, you know, in many cases they're looking to sort of showcase China in a good light, and part of that is interacting with the American academics and others who are interested in the study of China.
Okay, great. Why is it important to look at authoritarian regimes like China and international conflict?
Well, it's funny you should ask, because you know, maybe 50 years ago people would talk about autocracies as having sort of advantages because they're relatively opaque. It's hard to know what's exactly going on inside them. And by contrast, people would lament the inability of democracies to conduct foreign policy in sort of a sort of efficient manner. There's always compromise and negotiations that would go on before the country could articulate sort of its foreign policy. But recently, scholarship has swung in the other direction. And people have increasingly touted the advantages of democracy, of that same openness, and giving democracies advantages in all sorts of things like concluding trade agreements, winning wars, fighting on the battlefield, all sorts of things, advantages that have been attributed to democracies. And scholarship on the behavior of autocracies in international relations and international conflict has, in recent years, only begun to pick up. And sort of in this context, the argument that I put forward essentially levels the playing field between autocratic states like China and democratic states like the United States. So the argument that I put forward basically says that if you could imagine, say, a Democrat and autocrat sitting at a table negotiating, traditionally, some might say that the Democrat, the president or the prime minister, could say to his autocratic counterpart, look, Congress has spoken, I've pinned, basically, I don't have any flexibility. So if we're going to reach a deal, you, the autocrat, have to give way. And what I'm suggesting is that the autocrat may not face elections, but nonetheless, with mobs in the streets, you can say, well, you may have Congress, but look at me, I've got mobs. And as we know, that the consequences of being voted out of office are far less than perhaps the consequences of the mob storming the palace gates and potentially throwing the dictator into exile or something much worse.
Sure. Let's talk about some of the conclusions you reach in your paper.
Well, in the paper, I suggest that the anti-Japanese protests of 2005 were an effective part of China's diplomatic strategy to undermine Japan's bid for permanent membership on the UN Security Council. And in doing so, the Chinese were able to mount a campaign, particularly persuading those in the region, particularly the United States and nations in Southeast Asia, from tempering their public support for Japan's bid to be a permanent member of the Security Council.
Okay. And finally, in doing the research for your paper, what was one of the most surprising things you found?
Well, you know, people often assume that because China is an autocratic state that the people are more or less fed what the government wants them to hear, that there's a sense in which they aren't particularly well informed about foreign affairs or politics in general. And I actually found that to be absolutely not the case. And in fact, Chinese citizens, whether it's you know, your students in universities or you know, the notorious Beijing taxi cab drivers, they know a lot. In fact, I would wager that they know more about international relations than sort of their American equivalents. And so even though there's perhaps less space for political discourse, Nevertheless, the amount of information in their knowledge of world affairs is really quite striking.
Interesting. Thank you very much for being here with us today and sharing some of your research.
You're welcome.
For more information about Professor Weiss and her work, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.